Somewhere in America, in the autumn of 1967, a woman opened a letter from her son. She had been waiting for it. Mail from Vietnam came in bursts, 3 weeks of silence, and then 4 letters at once, all of them written on the same wet afternoon, all of them saying he was fine. This one was shorter than usual. It did not describe where he was. It did not describe what he had been doing. It asked for a package, and it listed what should go in it. 2 pairs of women's pantyhose, any size. Any brand, as long as they were nylon and not the thick ones. 1 box of sanitary napkins, the kind with the adhesive strip. 4 pairs of wool socks, the heavy civilian kind from the sporting goods aisle, not the ones the army sold. A dozen condoms, unlubricated, and if she could find them, and if she could afford them, 1 pair of Levi's 501 jeans, waist 32, and please do not wash them first. She read it twice. Then she folded it and did not show it to her husband, because there is no version of that list that a mother in 1967 reads without her stomach dropping. And there is no way for her to know from 6,000 miles away that every single item on it was there to keep her son alive. That is not a story about 1 letter. That is a story about thousands of them. Because the men fighting in Vietnam were quietly running a second supply chain, one that had nothing to do with the United States military, one that moved through the mail and the post exchange and the tailor shops of Saigon, and the things that moved along it were not luxuries or comforts. They were corrections. They were the field's answer to a set of problems that the Army and the Navy had either failed to anticipate or refused to admit existed. There were 2 uniforms in Vietnam. There was the one written down in the regulations, photographed for the manuals, packed in green crates and shipped across the Pacific by the ton. And there was the one men actually wore into the water at 2 in the morning, assembled item by item out of whatever worked, most of it bought with their own money, almost none of it appearing in any property book anywhere. I want to walk you through that second uniform. Not as a list of curiosities, but the way a man would have put it on, from the skin outward, layer by layer, until he was standing at the edge of a canal in the Rungsat, with a rifle he had sealed with a condom, and a wristwatch that cost him 3 months of pay. Every layer had a reason. Most of the reasons were things somebody had to bleed for first. Start with the ground, because the ground explains everything else. Southeast of Saigon, where the Saigon River braids apart on its way to the sea, there is a stretch of country the Vietnamese called Rung Sat. The name translates roughly as the Forest of Assassins, and it had earned it long before any American arrived. Something on the order of 400 square kilometers of mangrove, nipa palm, tidal creek, and mud. Not mud the way you picture mud. Mud with the consistency of wet cement that goes to your thigh and holds you there. Mud that pulls a boot off your foot in 1 step and keeps it. The tide moved through it twice a day, 6 feet of water arriving and leaving on a schedule that rearranged the map. A creek you crossed at midnight might be a mudflat at 3 in the morning, and the boat that inserted you might not be able to reach the same bank to take you out. Further south and west, the Mekong Delta was flatter and wetter and more populated, a landscape of rice paddy and canal, where the water table was essentially at the surface and where a man on patrol could reasonably expect to be wet in some form for the entire duration of an operation. Not damp, wet. Water in the boots, water in the trouser legs, water in the seams of everything he carried. The American military did not arrive in that landscape with equipment designed for it. It arrived with equipment designed by an institution whose recent memory ran through Northwest Europe and Korea, tested in places like the Jungle Warfare School in Panama, and procured on timelines that ran in years. Some of that gear was excellent. The tropical combat boot, with its drainage eyelets and its Panama sole that shed mud instead of packing it, was a genuinely good piece of engineering. The lightweight jungle fatigue was a real improvement over the herringbone twill of the previous generation. Nobody should pretend the Army was asleep. But there is a difference between designing for the tropics in general and designing for that specific patch of tidal swamp, and the gap between the two was where men lived. The procurement system worked on a cycle of testing and evaluation and contract award. The men in the Rungsat were working on a cycle of about 72 hours. When those two clocks disagree, the field wins, because the field has to. So they fixed it themselves. And the first thing a lot of them fixed was the thing closest to the skin, which was nothing at all. The standard issue undergarment was cotton. In a temperate climate, cotton underwear is fine, which is why nobody thought about it. In the Delta, cotton did what cotton does. It absorbed water and then it held it, and because the ambient humidity rarely dropped low enough for anything to dry, it held it indefinitely. A man could be out for 5 days, and the fabric against his groin would never once be dry in that entire period. Add friction from walking, add salt from sweat, add heat that stayed in the 90s overnight, and you have created something close to a laboratory culture. The results filled medical reports. Fungal infections in the groin and the folds of the skin. Bacterial infections that started as a raw patch from chafing and progressed until a man could not walk without pain. Cellulitis. The general category the troops called jungle rot, which covered a range of skin conditions that had one thing in common. They started with fabric that never dried and skin that never got air. Skin conditions were among the leading causes of days lost to illness in Vietnam. And while nobody was going to win a medal for it, a rifle company that has 4 men who cannot walk properly is a rifle company that has lost 4 men. The fix was not sophisticated. Men stopped wearing underwear. That is where the phrase entered American English, and it is not folklore, it is just what happened. No fabric meant no trapped water, no friction point, no incubator. The delta heat and the constant soaking were still there, but the skin could at least dry when the trousers dried, and get air when the trousers were open. It was a small improvement, and it mattered enormously. The men who wanted some layer under the trousers wrote home for silk or nylon. Silk boxer shorts, women's nylon briefs, anything with a synthetic weave that would shed water instead of holding it and would not saw at the skin with every step. Nylon dries in minutes. Silk dries almost as fast and is smoother against skin than any cotton ever made. The requests going into those letters produced some genuinely awkward moments on the receiving end, and there is a whole generation of American women who spent decades not quite explaining why they were buying women's underwear in a men's size in 1968. The reasoning was airtight. The conversation was excruciating. There is a symmetry here worth noticing. On the other side of the same swamp, Viet Cong fighters were cutting up captured or salvaged parachute silk and sewing it into undergarments for exactly the same reason. Two sides, opposite in almost every way, arriving independently at the same conclusion about what fabric does in a hot-wet climate. The swamp did not care which flag you carried. It applied the same physics to everyone. Which brings us to the layer that made this whole subject famous. The pantyhose. To understand why an elite maritime commando would pull on women's hosiery before an operation, you have to understand what was living in the water he was about to enter. Not metaphorically, literally. The tidal creeks of the Rungsat and the canals of the Delta were full of leeches. Not the small polite leeches of a New England pond. Aquatic and semi-aquatic leeches in numbers that are hard to convey, and land leeches in the wet vegetation above the waterline, which is the variety that genuinely unsettles people who have not encountered them, because land leeches move toward you. They sense heat and carbon dioxide and vibration. They lift the front of their bodies and they wave, and then they go. They are quick. They can cover ground faster than you would believe watching one. A leech does not bite the way you imagine. It opens a small 3-way incision with a set of chitinous jaws, and it releases an anticoagulant into the wound so the blood will not clot. The anesthetic component means most men never felt it happen. That is the part that matters tactically. You do not discover a leech by feeling it. You discover it later, when you look, and by then it has been feeding for an hour, and the wound will keep bleeding after you pull it off because the anticoagulant is still in the tissue. Now stack that reality onto an operation. A SEAL platoon inserts by boat at last light, slips into the water, and moves several hundred meters through chest-deep tidal creek to a position where they will lie in the mud and wait, motionless, for 4 hours or 8 hours, or until the target walks past. Motionless is the operative word. An ambush works because nobody moves. And a man who is being fed on by 15 leeches in the dark, some of them in places that are not reachable without standing up and undoing his trousers, is a man who is going to move. He is going to shift. He is going to make noise. Or he is going to lie there and not move and hold it, and spend every ounce of his attention on the thing crawling up his thigh instead of on the tree line where the enemy is going to appear. Discipline solves that for an hour. It does not solve it for 8. Then there is what happens afterward. The standard removal methods, a lit cigarette or a splash of insect repellent, are noisy or bright or smelly, and none of them are available in the middle of an operation. So the leeches came off after extraction, in the boat or back at the base, and every place one had been attached was an open wound that would not clot properly, in a climate where any open wound was a candidate for infection within a day. Blood loss was rarely the problem. The wounds were the problem. Men were coming back with 20 small infected sores on their legs and groin, and the medics were spending their time on that instead of on anything else. And the standard issue trousers did essentially nothing to stop it. The jungle fatigue was a cotton and nylon poplin with a relatively open weave, chosen deliberately for breathability and fast drying, both good qualities. But an open weave is an open door. A leech that cannot bite through the fabric will simply find the trouser cuff, the fly, the gap at the waist where the shirt rides up, and go in. The uniform was full of entrances. The nylon stocking closed all of them at once, and it did it through 3 separate properties that happened to line up perfectly. The first is mesh. Nylon hosiery is knitted at a density that a leech's jaw structure cannot penetrate or work through. Not because anyone designed it for that, obviously, but because that is what the material happens to be. Second is the surface. Nylon is slick. A leech moves by anchoring its rear sucker and reaching forward, then anchoring the front and drawing up the rear, and that whole locomotion depends on getting purchase. On a smooth synthetic surface under tension against a moving leg, it cannot get purchase. It slides. Third, and this is the one that people miss, hosiery is engineered to be continuous and gapless from the toes to the waist. That is its entire design purpose in its intended civilian application. There is no cuff to enter, no waistband gap, no seam that opens when you crouch. It is a sealed second skin. Put those 3 together and you have, essentially by accident, a purpose-built anti-leech garment that cost $1 and weighed almost nothing. And the benefits did not stop at leeches. The delta was also full of chiggers and mites and mosquitoes that would bite through loose fabric, and the same barrier stopped those too. There was a friction benefit, because a smooth synthetic layer under trousers means the trousers slide against the nylon instead of sawing at wet skin, which is the same problem the underwear was causing. Some men reported it helped with the heat rash. And because hosiery is knitted with elastic tension, it provided a mild compression on the legs during long movements under heavy load, which is the same reason athletes wear compression tights now, 60 years later, and pay a great deal more for them. Was it universal? No. Nothing in this story was universal. Some men found it unbearably hot, which it was. Some found it shredded on the first movement through elephant grass, which it did if you did not have a proper outer layer over it. Some units used it constantly, and some men in the same platoon refused. But it worked well enough and spread far enough that it turns up in accounts from SEAL platoons, from Army long-range reconnaissance patrols, from Special Forces teams working the border, and from ordinary infantry in wet terrain who had heard about it from someone else and written home. And I want to be honest about the comedy of it, because the comedy is the reason the story survives. There is something genuinely funny about the mental image. The most physically demanding, most aggressively masculine subculture the American military has ever produced, standing in a boat at dusk, pulling on women's pantyhose with the total unself-consciousness of men who long ago stopped caring what anything looked like. The joke was made at the time. Men made it about each other constantly. And then they put them on, because whatever the joke cost them was less than what the leeches cost them, and that trade was not close. That is the whole ethic of this story in one image. Dignity is a peacetime luxury. In the Rungsat, the only question anyone was asking was whether the thing worked. Over the hosiery went the trousers, and here the improvisation gets more surprising, because the men were not replacing standard issue with something better designed. They were replacing it with something not designed for the job at all. Levi's, ordinary civilian denim jeans. The 501 and the 505, specifically, which is a detail worth pausing on, because when men are that specific about a model number, they are not making a fashion choice. They are describing a tool. The problem with the jungle fatigue trouser was the cargo pocket. 2 large bellows pockets on the thighs, pleated so they could expand, which is exactly what you want in most environments. You can carry magazines in them, a map, a smoke grenade, a field dressing, all of it accessible without taking off your gear. In a dry environment, it is a good design. In the Rungsat, it was a liability, and the reason is simple hydraulics. A bellows pocket is a bag. Its whole purpose is to hold volume. When a man went into a canal, both of those bags filled. When he came out, they did not empty, because the pocket flap and the pleated construction and the sodden cotton all worked together to hold the water in. And in that particular swamp, it was not just water. It was water carrying a suspension of silt, fine enough to stay in the pocket after the water drained out. Delta mud has close to the density of wet concrete. A pocket holding a couple of liters of it is carrying several extra pounds on the thigh, at the worst possible point on the body for extra weight, because it is far from the center of mass and it swings. Multiply by 2 legs. Multiply by every water crossing, and in that terrain there were dozens per operation. Now imagine coming out of a canal onto a mud bank into contact, needing to move fast and low, with 10 pounds of swamp hanging off your legs and swinging with every stride. That is not a comfort complaint. That is a half second, and in an ambush at 15 meters, a half second is the entire argument. Denim solved it by geometry. A 501 has flat patch pockets sewn tight to the body with almost no volume. There is nothing to fill. Water sheets off the leg instead of collecting in it, and silt has nowhere to settle. The cut is close through the thigh, so there is no loose fabric to hold a bladder of water between the leg and the cloth. Coming up a muddy bank in denim, a man was carrying his own weight and not much else. The fabric had a second advantage that surprised people. Elephant grass, which grew in stands taller than a man across huge parts of the country, has serrated edges that will open a forearm like a paper cut and will shred lightweight poplin in an afternoon. Heavy denim at 14 ounces per yard with a tight twill weave did not shred. It took the abuse. A pair of Levi's could go through a season of that country and come out with nothing worse than fading, where the issue trousers might need replacing every few weeks. Now, the honest part, and this is where I think a lot of retellings of this story go wrong. Denim was not a straightforward upgrade. It was a trade with real costs. Wet denim is heavy, considerably heavier than wet poplin, and it takes far longer to dry, which is the opposite of what you want on a long patrol. It is hotter. It does not breathe. On a 5-day movement through the highlands, jeans would have been a genuinely bad idea and nobody sensible wore them there. But the SEAL mission profile in the Rungsat was not a 5-day movement. It was a night operation, often under 12 hours, insert by boat, move, wait, hit, extract by boat, back at the base by morning. Under that profile, the drying time barely mattered because you were going to be soaked the entire time regardless and dry when you got back. What mattered was drag, mud load, and speed on the bank. For that specific job, in that specific swamp, denim was better, and the men doing that job worked it out and told each other. That is what makes it interesting to me. It was not stubbornness or style, It was a group of people correctly identifying which variables mattered in their particular situation, and selecting for those, which is exactly what an equipment designer is supposed to do and could not do from an office in Natick. There was a whole parallel clothing economy behind this, and it ran out of Vietnamese tailor shops. In Saigon, in Da Nang, in the market streets near every large base, there were tailors who could take an issue uniform apart and rebuild it to a man's specification in about 2 days for a few dollars. Take the cargo pockets off. Move them to the calf where they sit lower and drain. Cut the shirt shorter so it does not bunch under a web belt. Take in the whole thing so nothing flaps and nothing catches. Sew in extra pockets where a man actually reached, which was rarely where the pattern maker had put them. Reinforce the seat and the knees. And above all, make it in tiger stripe, the dense horizontal camouflage pattern that had come out of the French colonial period and been picked up by the South Vietnamese Marines. A pattern that was never a standard American issue item, and that half the reconnaissance and special operations community in Vietnam wore anyway, because it worked better in that vegetation than the plain olive green did. Think about that for a second. Men were paying local civilian tailors out of their own pockets to manufacture their combat uniforms, because the ones the United States government issued them were the wrong shape. And the chain of command largely allowed it, because the officers running those units had been in the same water and knew perfectly well why. Below the trousers, the feet, and this is the part of the story that killed the most careers and ended the most tours, and almost nobody tells it because feet are not glamorous. The standard sock was cotton. Same material problem as the underwear, but with far worse consequences, because the foot spent more time submerged than any other part of the body, and because the foot is what you walk out on. Skin that stays wet for long enough stops behaving like skin. The outer layer softens and swells and loses its structural integrity. The small blood vessels constrict. Nerves stop reporting accurately, so a man can have serious tissue damage before he feels much of anything, and the first real sign is often numbness rather than pain. Left long enough, the tissue begins to die. It is the same condition that took men out of the trenches in Flanders in 1915, and it does not care that the water is warm instead of freezing, only that it is constant. In Vietnam they called it immersion foot, and the pictures in the medical literature are genuinely hard to look at. White, wrinkled, swollen feet, and then, in the advanced cases, feet that are not going to recover. A cotton sock made it worse in the most direct way possible. It absorbed the water and pressed it against the skin and would not let go of it. Even out of the water, standing in the sun, the cotton kept the foot in a wet compress. So the men wrote home for socks. This is one of my favorite details in the entire war, because it is so unheroic and so revealing. The most common care package request from Vietnam was not cigarettes or candy or magazines. Over and over, in letter after letter, it was socks. Wool socks, the thick civilian hiking kind, or all nylon dress socks, which sound absurd until you understand the mechanism. Wool holds its loft when wet and keeps a layer of insulating air against the skin and wicks moisture outward toward the boot instead of holding it in. Nylon barely absorbs at all. It just drains and dries. Either one, in that environment, was worth more to a rifleman than almost anything else in the package. Dry socks became a currency. Men carried spares sealed in plastic, changed them whenever there was a halt long enough, and the good squad leaders enforced it the way they enforced ammunition checks, because a man who could not walk was a man 4 other men had to carry. There is a real argument that the humble sock did more to keep American infantry in the field in Vietnam than any single piece of technology that was actually issued to them. Which brings us to what men were putting inside the boot, and to the item that raises the most eyebrows: sanitary napkins. 2 uses, both of them straightforward once you stop being embarrassed about it, which the men did within about a week of arriving. The first was as an insole. A pad has an absorbent core designed to take up fluid and hold it away from the surface in contact with skin. That is not a coincidence of manufacturing. That is precisely the engineering problem it was built for. In a jungle boot, laid flat under the foot, it did exactly the same job. It soaked up the water that came in through the drainage eyelets and the sweat that never stopped, and it kept the sole of the foot out of standing water. When it was saturated, you pulled it out and put in a new one, and the pack of them weighed nothing. The issue insole was a piece of mesh designed to let water pass through and let the boot breathe, which is fine in principle, but it did not manage moisture, it only moved it. The second use was on the shoulders. A rifleman in Vietnam was carrying somewhere between 50 and 80 pounds, and all of that weight came down through 2 strips of canvas webbing about 2 inches wide. The rucksack frames of that era did not transfer load to the hips the way a modern pack does. Everything sat on the shoulders. 2 inches of webbing carrying 40 pounds of downward force generates pressure that compresses the trapezius against the collarbone, and does it for 6 or 8 hours at a time, day after day. It cuts. It rubs the skin off. And it presses on the nerve bundle under the collarbone, which is why men reported their hands going numb and their arms losing strength. A sanitary pad has an adhesive strip on the back. Peel it, stick it to the underside of the shoulder strap, and now you have inserted a soft compressible layer between the webbing and the man, spreading the load over a wider area and cutting the friction. It is padding engineering, done correctly, using the only adhesive-backed absorbent foam product available for purchase within 10,000 miles. That the product had been designed for an entirely different purpose was, to the men doing it, completely irrelevant, and the fact that we still find it funny 60 years later says more about us than it does about them. Then the rifle, and here the improvisation was not about comfort. It was about whether the weapon would fire. The M16 that went to Vietnam in the mid-60s had a bad first act, and the details of why are ugly. The rifle had been designed and tested around one propellant, and then issued with a different one that burned dirtier and cycled the action faster than intended. Early rifles did not have chrome plating in the chamber, so fouling and moisture combined to corrode and pit the chamber walls, which caused fired cases to seize instead of extracting. Troops were told, in early briefings, that the weapon was largely self-cleaning, and did not require the constant maintenance they were used to, which was catastrophically wrong, and for a period cleaning kits were not issued in adequate numbers. Men died in 1966 and 1967 holding a rifle with a stuck case in the chamber, trying to knock it out with a cleaning rod under fire. A congressional subcommittee eventually investigated the whole thing, and the findings were damning. The A1 variant fixed most of it, with a chrome chamber, a buffer change, a forward assist, and a real cleaning program. But even a properly working rifle had a hard limit, and that limit was the muzzle. Get water in a barrel, then fire, and the incompressible column of water ahead of the bullet can spike pressure hard enough to bulge or split the barrel. Get mud in a barrel and you have an obstruction, and an obstruction is a burst barrel and a face full of steel. In a landscape where every operation involved swimming, wading, crawling through mud, and falling into things in the dark, the muzzle was the most vulnerable 2 centimeters on the entire weapon. Hence the condoms. Roll one over the flash suppressor and the barrel is sealed. Waterproof, dirt-proof, completely reliable, and it weighs nothing. The elegant part is that you did not have to remove it. If contact happened, you pulled the trigger, and the bullet went straight through the latex, and the round's performance at that distance was unaffected. Nothing to strip off, no delay, no fumbling in the dark. You simply put on a new one afterward. Men requested them from home and bought them by the box from the post exchange, and there is a whole subgenre of letter home that had to carefully explain, at length, that these were for the rifle. The muzzle was not the only thing men waterproofed. Ammunition went into plastic bags. 2 magazines got taped together upside down, so a reload was a flip rather than a reach into a pouch full of swamp. Every loose piece of equipment got tied to the man with a length of cord so that when he went into a canal at chest depth, it did not sink into the silt and disappear. Slings were taped so the metal swivels could not click. Dog tags were taped together or laced into a boot, because 2 pieces of stamped steel hanging around a man's neck make a distinct small sound in the dark, and a distinct small sound in the dark is how a night ambush finds you. The delta was a place where noise carried across water for hundreds of meters, and where men had developed a physical vocabulary of silence that no manual taught. On the wrist, one item that was not improvised so much as privately purchased, and it tells you something about how seriously these men took precision. Timing in a night operation is not approximate. The extraction boat comes to a specific bend in a specific creek at a specific minute, and it will not sit there, because sitting there is how boats get destroyed. Naval gunfire and artillery arrive at a coordinated time on a coordinated grid, and a man in the wrong place at that minute is killed by his own side. The tide, in the Rungsat, changed the geography of the entire operating area on a schedule, and being 40 minutes late meant the creek you planned to swim out through was now a mudflat you could not cross. The issue watch of the era was serviceable and no better than that. So men bought their own, and the ones that mattered to them were mechanical dive watches, because a mechanical movement has no battery to die, because a proper dive watch is sealed against water pressure far beyond anything a swamp can produce, because the luminous markings were readable in total darkness under a poncho, and because the rotating bezel on the outside is an elapsed time computer. Set the marker at the moment you step off the boat, and for the rest of the night, you can read your remaining window at a glance without doing arithmetic in your head at 3 in the morning while cold and frightened. A Rolex submariner or a Seiko diver represented serious money for an enlisted man. They bought them anyway, and they wore them into the water. And the reason a good watch became a marker of that community was not vanity. It was because the thing performed. Now the outermost layer, and this one is different in kind from everything else, because it stopped being about equipment and became about identity. On reconnaissance teams operating along the border and in areas where American units did not officially exist, the man walking at the front of the patrol was the point. In triple canopy jungle, the distance at which one patrol first sees another is not 200 meters. It is 10 meters, sometimes 5, and what happens in that moment is not a firefight in any tactical sense. It is a collision. Two groups of men suddenly on top of each other, and whichever one resolves the question of what am I looking at faster is the one that walks away. So point men began wearing captured enemy clothing and carrying captured enemy weapons, black peasant pajamas, or plain khaki, and an AK-47 instead of an M16. This was not disguise, and it is important to be precise about that, because it gets misremembered as some kind of infiltration trick. Nobody was fooling anyone for longer than a moment. The moment was the entire point. An enemy soldier who comes around a bend and sees an American silhouette has an instant, reflexive, trained recognition. The same soldier who sees a familiar outline in familiar clothing with a familiar weapon experiences something else, a beat of hesitation while his brain resolves the ambiguity, and that beat might be half a second. The sound reinforced it. Anyone who had spent time in that war could tell an M16 from an AK by ear instantly, and the first burst coming from the front of a patrol sounding like an AK bought another fraction of a beat. Half a second, at 7 meters, is who fires first, and who fires first at 7 meters usually decides it. That is the entire calculation, and it was a deliberate and widely used tactical choice on those teams, documented at length by the men who ran those missions. The same logic extended into places most people never think about. Teams going out sterile carried no identification, no letters, no unit insignia, nothing with a name on it. And they thought hard about smell, because a human being can smell another human being in dense jungle at a surprising distance if the smells are foreign to the place. American soap, American aftershave, American toothpaste, American cigarette smoke, the detergent smell of laundered clothing, and above all the smell that comes out of a man's pores after weeks of eating American rations. Teams stopped using scented anything for days before an operation. Some ate Vietnamese food, rice and fish, in the days before going out, so that what came through the skin smelled like the country rather than like the commissary. That is a level of attention to detail that most people would never think to have, arrived at by men who noticed that they themselves could smell the enemy and reasoned correctly that it worked in both directions. Almost none of this went through official channels. It moved the way folk knowledge always moves, which is person to person, and the transmission network is worth admiring on its own terms. A replacement arriving in country knew nothing. Within a week, somebody who had been there 8 months would have told him to stop wearing his underwear, to tape his dog tags, to get his mother to send wool socks, to keep a condom on the muzzle, and where in town to get his uniform recut. None of it was written down. All of it was current, because it was being revised constantly by the people using it. When something stopped working, word of that moved just as fast. Underneath the whole thing sat the mail, which was the most effective logistics system in the theater, and was operated entirely by mothers, wives, and girlfriends, who mostly had no idea what they were participating in. A woman in Ohio was, functionally, a supply node. She got a list. She went to the drugstore and the sporting goods store, she packed a box, and about 3 weeks later, a squad in the Delta was better equipped than the United States Army had managed to make it. Mail order catalogs did the rest. Men ordered knives from Randall in Florida and waited months for them. They ordered compasses and boots and lighters and holsters. The country's civilian retail economy quietly outfitted a meaningful fraction of the men fighting its war. I do not want to romanticize any of this, because the improvisations were not all good, and pretending otherwise is a disservice. Some of them were bad ideas. Non-issue gear had no supply chain behind it, so when your privately purchased boots wore out in the field, there was no replacement, only whatever you could scrounge. Denim on a long patrol was miserable and could contribute to the very skin problems men were trying to escape. Men who wore enemy uniforms took a genuine risk of being shot by other Americans, and it happened. And there is a harder legal edge to it as well, because a man captured in the enemy's uniform has forfeited whatever protection the laws of war might have offered him, and the men doing it understood that and did it anyway. Every one of these solutions was a trade, and the men making them knew they were trading. Here is the thing that stays with me, though, and it is not the pantyhose or the jeans. It is that almost none of it appears in any official record. There is no line item for a pair of Levi's in a Navy supply document. No requisition form for hosiery. There is no after-action report that mentions a sanitary napkin under a rucksack strap. No citation that says a man survived a contact because his point man had bought a beat of hesitation with an AK-47 and a set of black pajamas. The paper trail of that war is enormous, and this entire body of knowledge, which men's lives depended on daily, is almost entirely absent from it. It survives in 3 places: in the memory of men who are now in their late 70s and 80s, in letters, mostly the ones the families kept, and in objects, sitting in boxes in attics and garages, that nobody left alive can explain. That last one is why I wrote a book. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it is down in the description. It is a practical guide to rebuilding an American serviceman's Second World War record from almost nothing: a name, 1 photograph, and a box of objects nobody ever explained. Where the records live, what survived the fire, how to read what you find. If that box is in your house, you can still find out what it means. Because these things do get lost, and they get lost fast. The Vietnam generation was, in an enormous number of cases, the sons of the men who fought the war before it. The same instinct to fix things in the field, the same habit of writing home for what the army could not supply, the same silence afterward about what they had actually done, and the same boxes. The military did eventually learn, and it is worth saying so, because the story is not simply one of institutional stupidity. Chrome-lined barrels became standard. Wool and then synthetic socks replaced cotton in the issue system, and modern polypropylene sock liners are, functionally, the descendants of the ones men bought at the sporting goods store in 1968. Boot design kept improving. Underwear went synthetic. Load-bearing gear moved onto the hips and got padded properly. Camouflage patterns got taken seriously. And there is now an explicit acceptance across most special operations units that the man doing the mission should be able to select some of his own equipment, that his judgment about what works is worth something, and that the field can see things the procurement system cannot. That principle was paid for in the Rungsat. So go back to the letter. She bought the pantyhose. Of course she did. She was probably mortified in the checkout line, and she probably lay awake that night constructing theories about what her son had gotten into. She packed the box, and she wrote a note to go on top of it that said she loved him, and that his sister had made the team, and she sent it. And 3 weeks later, it arrived at a base on a river southeast of Saigon. And on some night after that, a young man sat on the deck of a boat in the dark, and he pulled on a pair of women's nylons his mother had bought, and then a pair of jeans over them, and he checked the condom over his muzzle and the tape on his dog tags and the bezel on his watch, and he stepped off into water that was warm as a bath and black as anything you have ever seen. And he did his job, and he came home in the morning with dry feet and no leeches and everything working. That is not a funny story. It only sounds like one. If you served over there, and you used any of this, or you worked out something of your own that never made it into a book, put it in the comments. Genuinely. There are people reading this who are trying to understand what their father or their grandfather did, and the small specific detail you remember about a pocket or a sock or a piece of tape is exactly the kind of thing that will never be in an archive unless somebody like you writes it down. The official history is safe. This one is not, and it disappears a little more every year. Sources are in the description. Subscribe if you want more of the war that did not make it into the textbooks. And to the men who worked it out in the mud, one small correction at a time, without waiting for permission. This one was yours.